Alan.
Every day, Cintas service reps help businesses get ready for the workday. They provide freshly laundered workwear delivered every week. Mats, mops, restroom and cleaning supplies. First aid and safety products to help your employees stay safe. They even test and inspect fire extinguishers and emergency lights. Cintas helps keep your business running smoothly. See what Cintas can do for you. Visit Cintas.com.
Oh, I'm ready!
And get ready for the workday.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. With Cybersecurity Awareness Month winding down, LifeLock wants to remind you to update your software. These updates will patch up security issues that identity thieves can exploit to gain access to your personal info. For comprehensive identity theft protection, there's LifeLock. LifeLock alerts you to more uses of your personal info and fixes issues that arise. Protect your identity today with a 30-day free trial at LifeLock.com/podcast.
Abramowitz of Emory University joining us as we continue our look at Georgia as a battleground state. Professor, thanks for giving us your time.
Sure, glad to be with you.
I suppose everybody has a take of why Georgia is a battleground state. What would you say?
Well, I would say that Georgia has become a battleground state primarily because of shifting demographics and also the changing appeal of the Republican Party nationally among college-educated white voters who are found in large numbers in the Atlanta suburbs.
Can you elaborate on that last point?
Sure. So if you look at the voting patterns in the state, we see that Democrats have made large gains in the Atlanta suburbs. So the city of Atlanta itself and the inner suburbs surrounding it have long been Democratic strongholds. The most significant change that we've seen has been a dramatic improvement in the Democratic vote share in some of the other surrounding suburban counties like Cobb County and Gwinnett County, which not too long ago, meaning maybe 15 years ago, were pretty strongly Republican in their preferences. Now, those counties have shifted to the Democrats. And two things are contributing to that. One is that demographics of those counties are changing, and the non-white share of the electorate in the Atlanta suburbs has increased pretty dramatically, especially the African-American share, but also Latino and Asian American. But in addition, we've seen that college-educated white voters in the Atlanta suburbs, as in many other metropolitan areas around the country, have been turned off by the direction of the Republican Party under Donald Trump. And so while we've seen the Republicans making gains among non-college white voters and in rural areas, we've seen at the same time the Republicans losing ground to Democrats among college-educated white voters, and particularly those found in large numbers in the suburbs of many of the major metropolitan areas of the country, and that includes Atlanta.
When you see then polling that shows close races, particularly in battleground ones, when you see the ones for Georgia, what's your level of confidence in what you're seeing?
I'm pretty confident that it's going to be a close election here. I would not be very confident in predicting who's going to win it. I think it's going to be within 2 points or 3 points at most in one way or the other. And that's the way it's been in recent elections. Except for a couple of elections for governor where we had Brian Kemp won pretty easily, but he had the benefit of incumbency. But in the Senate elections in 2020 and again in 2022, and in the presidential election in 2020, of course, we saw very, very close contests decided by a margin of no more than 1 or 2 points. And so I'm expecting to see the same thing this year.
You do your own modeling when it comes to elections in a poll or a model that's called Time for Change. Can you tell our viewers about that, and what does this year's model suggest?
Sure. Well, I have a forecasting model that I've been using for quite a few years, and it tries to predict the outcome of the presidential election at the national level. It's not looking at the swing states in particular, but just the national results. And it's based on 3 predictors. One is the incumbent president's approval rating in the middle of the year. The second is the growth rate of the economy in the second quarter in real terms. And the third is this time for change factor, which is simply based on how long the incumbent party has been in power. And I find that first-term incumbents have a significant advantage that they lose in the second or later term elections, even if an incumbent is personally running. And so you put those three things together and you get a fairly accurate prediction, and you get it several months in advance of the election. And indeed, I find that if you wait longer and try to make the prediction based on data closer to the election, you actually don't get any significant improvement. And I have this feeling about a lot of the modeling that's going on right now, that all of these forecasting models that are updating their forecasts on a daily basis aren't really getting any significant improvement. I think that we're going to probably know as much as we're going to know on election day right now. Or in fact, we probably knew as much as we're going to know on election day several weeks ago. The underlying factors are pretty much set. They're not changing. And so when I take those three factors and I put them together and statistically estimate where the election is likely to come out, and I have two predictions, one for the popular vote and one for the electoral vote, because obviously we need to know how the electoral vote is going to come out to really know who's going to win. And this year, both of those predictions come out with a very slight edge for Kamala Harris. And the popular vote margin is predicted to be in the vicinity of 2.5 to 3 percentage points. 2.8 actually is the exact number, but that's not terribly meaningful. But in that range, 2.5 to 3 percentage points in the popular vote. And then in terms of the electoral vote, it gives Harris a predicted 284 electoral votes, which is barely enough to win. So the two results are pretty similar. But given the margin of error that you have in these sorts of forecasts, which is unavoidable, where I'm really coming out is saying that I think Kamala Harris has a pretty strong chance of winning the popular vote, somewhere in the vicinity of 75%. But when it comes to the electoral vote, her chances of winning are lower, closer to 60%. And so that leaves us with a pretty significant chance that we get another election in which the popular vote winner loses the electoral vote. And there's about one chance in 6, according to my model, of that happening. And I think if you look at some of the other forecasting models, they're seeing something very similar.
Just want to take a break. Let's let Anarg, if you want to ask our guest questions about Georgia as a battleground state, he's going to join us. It's 202-748-8001 for those who support former President Trump, 202-748-8000 for supporters of the vice president. For those undecided, 202-748-8002. And Georgia residents, 202-748-8003. Alan Abramowitz joining us from Emory University. You talked about forecasting on the big scale. Can we narrow it down a bit? Over 1 million people so far going early to register their vote there in the state. What does that suggest to you about an outcome, even if there is a way to tell what an outcome could be because of those early numbers?
I don't think the early voting numbers really give us much of a clue about the outcome of the election. They tell us that there's a lot of enthusiasm for voting. You would have to break that down and kind of look at what the turnout rates are across the state in some of the different counties, depending on whether they're strongly Democratic or Republican. There are certain counties, of course, that we know are heavily Republican or heavily Democratic. I haven't seen that done, but even if we had that information, it still really wouldn't tell us much because, of course, we know that a lot of voters will wait and vote on Election Day. And, it doesn't matter when people vote. So the fact that, let's say, Democrats are disproportionately voting early doesn't necessarily mean that, the election is going to turn out in favor of the Democratic candidate. It just means that Democrats are voting early and Republicans might choose to vote on Election Day. That's what happened in 2020. It looks like that's not happening to the same degree this year. We know Republicans have been encouraging their voters to turn out early. The parties like their voters to turn out early, of course, get their vote locked in, and then they don't have to worry about contacting them and trying to get them to the polls on election day. So it makes things easier for the parties, but it's not really very predictive of anything.
Then when it comes to the state itself, we've been showing people a map of the state so far. What are those areas of the state that you would pay particular interest to see as a determining factor of who wins?
I mean, I would look at both the turnout and the margins in the Atlanta suburbs. I think that those are the sort of swing counties in the state. See if the Democrats can maintain the kind of advantage they've had in recent elections in counties like Cobb County and Gwinnett County. See if the Democrats get the big margins they need out of, say, DeKalb and Fulton County. And then look at how the Republicans are doing in some of the sort of more peripheral suburban counties, like Forsyth County, that's been continued to be a Republican stronghold, but with Democrats making some inroads there. So I think we have to look at the suburbs, but we also have to look at the party's margins in their strongholds, which for the Democrats is, of course, city of Atlanta and the inner suburban counties. For the Republicans, it's the outer suburban counties, as well as the small towns and rural areas of the state. I guess we pretty much have to look everywhere. It's hard to pinpoint any one place to really look, but I would compare the performance of the parties once we start to see results with the way they've performed in other recent elections like the 2020 and 2022 elections, which were very close.
Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
I was going to ask you, we showed people the results of the 2020 election. Do you think that margin, that closeness is going to be a similar thing this time around?
It certainly could be very close again. I wouldn't necessarily predict it's going to be, 11,000 or so votes or 12,000. It could very well be, somewhat larger than that. But in terms of a percentage point margin, I'd be surprised if either Trump or Harris wins the state by more than, say, 2 percentage points.
Again, our guest with us, and if you want to ask him questions, it's 202-748-8001 for those of you who support former President Trump, 202-748-8000 for supporters of the vice president. Those undecided voters out there, it's 202-748-8002. And then Georgia residents, 202-748-8003. You were talking about your modeling and economics coming into it, Professor. If you take a look at the economics of the state itself, what does that tell you about who's going to cast their vote for whom?
Well, Georgia's economy is very strong right now. We have, low unemployment. We have strong economic growth. Pretty steady job creation. But then the national economy is also quite strong. If we look at the recent numbers, both in terms of inflation, which has come down quite a bit, job creation, which remains strong, unemployment remains low, real GDP growth in the second quarter, which happens to be, that's the actual term that's included in my forecasting model, that came in at 3% on an annual basis. So 3% is a very solid performance. And now the predictions are that the third quarter will actually come out slightly above that. So in objective terms, the economy is doing quite well. The subjective economy is not so good. That's the interesting thing here, that despite the fact that all the objective indicators show that the U.S. economy, is doing very well, and better, by the way, than the economies of most other advanced industrialized countries. When people are asked about the economy, they don't feel positive about it. Many of them don't. Part of that is partisan. Republicans think the economy is terrible because former President Trump keeps telling them that. But really, across the board, perceptions of economic conditions are not as positive as you might expect, given what the objective indicators show. So, ultimately, it'll be a question of whether those subjective perceptions, dominate the objective evidence that the economy is actually doing quite well.
From Daryl in Kentucky, a supporter of President Trump, former President Trump, on this battleground state of Georgia, talking with Alan Abramowitz. Daryl, go ahead. Oh, he's gone? Let's hear from Alan. Alan in Illinois, a supporter of Vice President Harris. Hello.
Hello.
You're on. Go ahead, please.
Okay. I was just wondering, with President Carter's 100th birthday and the trip that Kamala made to the rural areas, if that has made any contribution.
Okay. That's Alan in Illinois.
I would say that, we're seeing that Harris has been making some effort to reach out to some parts of the state, and this is similar to what she's doing in some of the other swing states, to some of the small towns and rural areas, having some events, outside of the big metropolitan areas, to try to make some inroads there, because one of the keys to the outcome of this election is going to be not just how well the candidates do in their own areas of strength, but whether they can reduce their deficits in the areas that they know they're going to lose. So there's no doubt that Harris is going to lose small town and rural Georgia by a big margin. But if she can lose those areas by a somewhat smaller margin, even a slightly smaller margin than, say, other Democrats have in recent elections, including, say, Biden in 2020, then that can have a big impact on the overall outcome. And so outreach to parts of the state that are not in your base, I think can be effective. President Carter's 100th birthday and his vote for Kamala Harris got quite a bit of coverage in the news. I don't think it's going to have much impact on people's voting decisions, however, and everyone understands that former President Carter is a strong Democrat, and as he himself said, I think he's never voted for a Republican in his life, so it's hardly surprising that he voted for Kamala Harris.
Professor, we saw the vice president in two churches on Sunday. When it comes
Yes.
to the state's dynamics, how does religious voters factor into that?
Well, it's very interesting. Traditionally, Democratic candidates have put a lot of time and effort into mobilizing black voters through the churches. And this particular Sunday, the last couple of Sundays before the election, where we have early voting, have been a time when there's been a major effort made by Democrats to mobilize black voters to the polls. I think it's sometimes called souls to the polls. Mm-hmm. And so the effort is you have your service and then you vote, because there's early voting in the afternoon on Sundays. And this is something Democrats pushed for very hard, and certainly they've been making a big effort to do that. The African-American turnout, of course, is going to be one of the big keys to the outcome of the election. Democrats need a strong African-American turnout, and of course they also need to win the overwhelming majority of the African-American vote. And the other side of that equation, though, is that white evangelical voters in Georgia, which is a very large group as well, tend to be quite conservative here and vote overwhelmingly Republican. And that's true across the country, but that's another rather large voting bloc here in Georgia. In many of the small towns and rural areas of the state, you have a very large percentage of the electorate made up of white evangelical voters. And so, you have the counterbalance between the white evangelical vote on the one hand and the African-American vote on the other hand. In terms of religion, both groups tend to be fairly religious and have somewhat similar religious beliefs, I would say. But politically, they're diametrically opposed.
Sean is in New York on our undecided line. Go ahead.
Hi, good morning. So I just heard you mention something about the economy doing well. Well, just on Friday, the American public amongst the SNAP system just withdrew $85 million from Americans' bank accounts. I believe we are $34 trillion and approaching $35 trillion in debt. People are paying more for groceries nationwide. We're just in a terrible, Boeing just laid off tens of thousands of workers on top of that. I mean, how can you sit here and say that the economy is doing well when, in accordance to not just how we feel, but what we see what's going on, how can you say that the economy is doing well?
Okay. So I understand where you're coming from. And certainly prices are a lot higher now than they were 4 years ago for many basic goods and services. And I think people are still somewhat upset about that. You mentioned Boeing laying off workers. So, yes, I mean, there are those negative developments. What I'm saying is that if you look at the objective numbers and look at the trends in the economy as measured by, the best indicators that we have available, we can say that they are quite positive. And what I'm talking about is A, unemployment. It's very low. B, job creation is very strong. We had well over 200,000 jobs created in the most recent monthly report. Inflation is way down from where it was. We had very high inflation, but it's come way down. It's come down close to the 2% range that the Federal Reserve was looking for, or has as its guideline. And that has allowed the Fed to lower interest rates. So with lower interest rates, we're seeing that begin to work its way through the economy with lower mortgage interest rates and lower credit card interest rates, things that directly affect people's lives. So it takes time for those things to be felt. So I'm not saying, people's perceptions are not wrong necessarily, but I'm just saying that this is what the statistics tell us. And I'm a believer in data and evidence. And I think sometimes our own personal perceptions and feelings can lead us astray because they're based on our own personal situation, which is not necessarily representative of the entire country. So I think it's important to look at the evidence. It's important to look at the data. And what the evidence and the data tell us is that the economy is doing quite well.
When it comes to data, Professor, then what are you watching for in the next couple of weeks?
Well, I mean, everyone's obviously watching for the polling data. It's been kind of frustrating in that regard, in that given how close we are to the election now, barely 2 weeks away, we haven't had a lot of, recently high-quality national polls, or even more so, high-quality polls in some of the swing states. Now, I think that will change in the next week or so. I think we're going to begin to see a lot more quality polling. We've had a lot of polls, but frankly, I consider some of them pretty sketchy and questionable. But I think we're going to see more. The Washington Post just came out with today, actually, with a new series of swing state polls, and I would consider those pretty reputable. But they pretty much tell us what we've already knew from earlier polling, which is that the race is very close. I mean, it shows a very tight race in the swing states, almost dead even, in fact, with Harris leading in a few states and Trump leading in a couple of states. So the takeaway is just basically that this is a very close election. And frankly, I don't think we're really going to have any way of confidently predicting the outcome before Election Day. I think we're going to have to wait for the election returns this time. It's not going to be a landslide election. It's not one of those elections where we know well in advance who the winner is going to be. It's going to be one of those elections where we won't know until late into the night, or possibly the next day or even later, what the final outcome is going to be. Other things they're looking for, other economic numbers will be coming out, but at this point, I don't think they're going to change people's perceptions very much.
What's your level of confidence in the election system there in Georgia and the ability to have an accurate count?
Yeah, I'm quite confident about the election system in Georgia. I think that we have a very competent Secretary of State, and I think the people running the election know what they're doing, and I think they're not going to be deterred by any threats, which we see happening all the time. And we also had some decisions made recently by the courts here in Georgia, reversing some rules that were put in place by our state election board that were very questionable. A very partisan election board, by the way, dominated by Trump supporters. But with those court rulings, which I think, for example, got rid of the need to have a hand count of the ballots on election night, which just would have caused chaos, could have caused long delays and confusion. So apparently that's not going to happen. So I'm pretty confident we're going to get an accurate count here. We may not know the results, for a while, because if the election is very close, it's going to take many hours, or it could take many hours to determine who the winner is. But in the end, I think we'll get an accurate count here, and I think that'll be true almost everywhere across the country. I'm a little more concerned about what the reaction is going to be afterwards, particularly from Mr. Trump and his supporters, if it doesn't turn out the way they want.
Alan Abramowitz with Emory University, finishing our look at the battleground state of Georgia. Professor, thanks for your time.
Very glad to be with you.